On November 14th, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit arrivals hall of Washington Dulles International Airport, Elias Kincaid, a senior United States diplomat returning from a grueling 3-month negotiation in West Africa, was unlawfully detained by Customs and Border Protection Officer Kyle Riggs. Officer Riggs, citing a fraudulent diplomatic passport, subjected Mr. Kincaid to public humiliation, physical force, and an hour of illegal confinement based on nothing more than the color of his skin. The incident, captured on the airport's unblinking surveillance network and the cell phones of a dozen shocked travelers, would ignite an international firestorm, culminating in a $9 million lawsuit that would expose a pattern of racial profiling at the nation's gateway. This is the story of that hour. The air in the customs hall was thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and disinfectant, a universal perfume of institutional transit. Elias Kincaid felt the familiar exhaustion deep in his bones, the kind that comes after 22 hours of travel across 5 time zones. He wore a simple, charcoal gray polo shirt and worn denim jeans, his only concession to comfort for the long flight home. He wanted nothing more than a hot shower and his own bed. He shuffled forward in the queue, his well-worn leather carry-on bag slung over a shoulder that ached with fatigue. Finally, it was his turn. He stepped up to the booth, placing his dark blue passport into the worn stainless steel tray. The officer behind the glass, a man whose name tag read K. Riggs, had a thick neck and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed in suspicion. He picked up the passport with a theatrical slowness, his thumb rubbing over the gold-embossed Great Seal of the United States, as if checking for a cheap foil knockoff. "Morning," Elias said, his voice a low, tired rumble. Riggs didn't respond. He flipped open the passport, his gaze flicking from the photograph to Elias's face and back again. The silence stretched, becoming deliberate and heavy. "Purpose of your travel?" Riggs asked, his tone flat, accusatory. "Official business," Elias replied. Returning from a posting, Riggs smirked, a small, ugly twist of his lips. He tapped a thick finger on the word diplomatic printed at the top of the page. "Official business. Right. You a diplomat?" The question was drenched in disbelief. "Yes, I am," Elias said, keeping his voice even, refusing to rise to the bait. He had dealt with far more dangerous men in far more volatile situations. This was just a bureaucrat with an ego. But there was something else in the officer's eyes, a familiar, ugly flicker of prejudice he had seen his entire life, in places as varied as a corporate boardroom and a sun-baked checkpoint in a war-torn country. It was the look of a man who had already decided who Elias was, and no document, no matter how official, was going to change his mind. Riggs held the passport up to the light, angling it this way and that. "This is a very good fake," he said, not to Elias, but to himself, as if admiring a piece of criminal craftsmanship. "Almost perfect. The paperweight is good. The font is close. But you guys always miss something." He finally met Elias's eyes again, his own gleaming with a hunter's satisfaction. "Where'd you get it? Lagos? Kinshasa? They do good work there." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. The family behind Elias, a young couple with a tired toddler, shifted uncomfortably. Elias felt their eyes on him, the sudden change in atmosphere from mundane travel weariness to a public spectacle. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the years of training in de-escalation kicking in. "Officer," he began, his voice a model of calm precision, "that is a United States diplomatic passport, issued by the Department of State. It is not fake." Riggs let out a short, barking laugh. "That's what they all say? You work for the State Department?" "Sure you do." "What do you do there?" "Sort the mail." The insult was so juvenile, so naked in its racism, that for a moment Elias was stunned. He had negotiated peace terms between warlords and stared down men who had committed unspeakable atrocities. Yet here, on his own soil, he was being reduced to a caricature by a man in a government-issued uniform. The line had stalled completely. More people were watching now, their faces a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. A teenager a few feet away subtly angled his phone, the small red light of a recording app blinking almost imperceptibly. Elias recognized the moment for what it was, a crossroads. He could argue, raise his voice, and fulfill the stereotype Riggs was so eager to project onto him. Or he could hold his ground with the quiet, unyielding force of the truth. He chose the latter. I have additional identification if you require it, Elias said, reaching slowly for the inner pocket of his jacket. A State Department ID card and my driver's license. Riggs's hand shot up. Don't you move. Keep your hands where I can see them. The command was sharp, loud enough to make several people jump. The officer's posture changed. He straightened up, puffing out his chest, his hand drifting down to rest near the butt of his sidearm. The theater was escalating. You think you can just flash some fake IDs and walk through here? You picked the wrong officer, pal. You picked the wrong day. He gestured with his head to the side. Step out of the line. Over there. Now Elias did not move. He looked calmly at Riggs, his gaze steady. Officer, you have no legal basis to detain me. That is a valid travel document. If you run the number in your system, you will see that Riggs's face darkened with rage. The quiet defiance was something he clearly wasn't used to. He was accustomed to fear, to immediate compliance. I give the orders here, he snarled, his voice dropping to a low growl. I said step aside, or I will remove you myself. The threat was explicit. The air crackled with tension. Behind him, Elias heard a woman whisper, "Oh my God." This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was an assault on his dignity, his identity, and his rights as a citizen, let alone a diplomat. And it was happening in front of the world. Officer Riggs, Elias said, his voice still quiet, but now laced with the hard edge of command he reserved for moments of true crisis. I am advising you to terminate this interaction. You are making a serious mistake. For an answer, Riggs came out from behind the booth, his movements swift and aggressive. He grabbed Elias's arm just above the elbow, his fingers digging into the muscle. The grip was shockingly strong, meant to inflict pain and assert dominance. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The physical contact was a declaration of war. Elias felt a surge of hot anger, a visceral, primal instinct to retaliate, to meet force with force. But he crushed it instantly. He knew that any physical reaction from him would be twisted and used as justification. He would be the aggressive black man, the resisting suspect. Riggs would be the hero officer who subdued a threat. So he stood perfectly still, allowing the officer to manhandle him, his body rigid but his mind racing, cataloging every detail. The pressure of the grip, the scent of stale coffee on Riggs's breath, the shocked faces in the crowd, the growing number of glowing cell phone screens pointed in his direction. You're resisting, Riggs grunted, pulling him harder. That's another charge. I am not resisting, Elias said, his voice tight with controlled fury. You are assaulting me. He was being pulled out of the line, a public spectacle of humiliation. He was no longer Mr. Kincaid, special envoy. He was just another black man being put in his place. Riggs shoved him toward a frosted glass door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." We're going to have a long talk, you and I. We're going to find out who you really are. The door swung open into a sterile, windowless room. It was painted a depressing institutional beige, with a few uncomfortable plastic chairs and a large table bolted to the floor. The only decoration was a faded poster detailing customs regulations. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an irritating, monotonous hum. The air was cold and still. Riggs shoved Elias toward one of the chairs. Sit down. Don't move. Another officer was already in the room, a younger man named Peterson, who looked barely out of his 20s. He had a nervous energy, his eyes darting from Riggs to Elias and back again. He seemed unsure of his role in the unfolding drama. Got one, Riggs announced with a triumphant swagger, tossing the blue passport onto the table. High-end forgery. This guy here thinks he's a diplomat. Peterson picked up the passport, handling it with a curiosity that lacked Riggs's aggressive certainty. He looked at the photo, then at Elias. Sir, he's not a sir, he's a suspect, Riggs snapped, cutting him off. He leaned over the table, his face close to Elias's. Now, let's try this again. What's your real name? Who do you work for? Who made this for you? Elias looked past Riggs, directly at the younger officer. He saw a flicker of doubt in Peterson's eyes, a hint of professional unease. That was his opening. Officer Peterson, Elias said, his tone calm and formal. For your information, your partner has just committed a felony. Under 18 U.S. Code Section 112, it is a federal crime to assault or imprison a foreign official or an internationally protected person. While I am a U.S. citizen, A diplomat on official travel is afforded those same protections on U.S. soil. Furthermore, he has violated the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961. Riggs straightened up and laughed, a loud, derisive sound that echoed in the small room. Vienna Convention? You've been watching spy movies? You have no rights here except the ones I give you. You're in a federal facility. I am the law here. He paced the small room like a caged animal. You're facing serious time. Forgery of a federal document, making false statements to a federal officer, resisting arrest. We can keep you here for as long as we want. We'll hand you over to the FBI. You'll be a guest of the federal government for a very, very long time. Is that what you want? The threats were a textbook intimidation tactic, designed to break a suspect's will. But Elias wasn't a suspect. He was a man who had dedicated his life to the law. International law, the very framework that governed the interactions between nations. He knew his rights with an intimacy Riggs couldn't possibly comprehend. He decided the time for quiet compliance was over. He had given Riggs every opportunity to de-escalate, to check the facts, to simply do his job correctly. The officer had refused, choosing prejudice over procedure at every turn. Now, it was time to change the terms of engagement. He sat up straighter in the hard plastic chair, his posture shifting from that of a weary traveler to that of a man in command. He looked directly at the one-way mirror on the far wall, knowing there was a camera behind it. He was creating a record. Let the record show, he said, his voice clear and resonant, that I am being held against my will. My name is Elias Kincaid. I am a special envoy with the United States Department of State, rank of Minister Counselor. He paused, letting the weight of the title settle in the cold room. My diplomatic passport, number D749-218-843, is authentic. My State Department credentials are in my jacket pocket, which Officer Riggs has refused to allow me to present. He turned his penetrating gaze from the mirror to Officer Peterson, bypassing Riggs entirely. Officer Peterson, I strongly advise you to contact your shift supervisor immediately. Your partner, Officer Riggs, is currently creating a diplomatic incident that will have severe repercussions for your agency and for him personally. He has committed an act of unlawful detention and assault. You are now a party to that act. If you wish to mitigate your own culpability, you will make that call now. The air in the room shifted. The precision of the language, the recitation of the passport number from memory, the direct and legally sound warning. It all combined to pierce through Riggs's blustering authority. Peterson took an involuntary step back, his face paling. He looked at Riggs, his expression now one of open alarm. Riggs, maybe we should just run the number, Peterson whispered, his voice barely audible. Just to be sure, Riggs's face contorted in a mask of fury and wounded pride. He felt his power slipping. The narrative he had constructed, brave officer catches sophisticated criminal, crumbling around him. I'm handling this, he hissed at Peterson, shoving him lightly. He's trying to play us, but the bravado was gone from his voice. It was replaced by a brittle, defensive edge. His confidence had been shaken. He glared at Elias, searching for a sign of deception, a flicker of fear. He found none. Elias simply met his gaze with an unnerving calm, the calm of a man who held a winning hand and was merely waiting for his opponent to concede the game. The younger officer, Peterson, was visibly shaken. He kept glancing from his partner's enraged face to Elias's composed demeanor, and the calculation was clear in his eyes. He was a follower, but he wasn't stupid. He recognized the difference between a cornered criminal and a man of genuine authority. Riggs, he said again, more firmly this time. Call the supervisor, or I will. This was mutiny. For a moment, it looked as if Riggs might turn his rage on his own partner. His fists clenched, and a vein pulsed in his temple. The small room felt like a pressure cooker. But the seed of doubt Elias had planted had taken root. What if he was wrong? The consequences, which had been an abstract concept moments ago, were suddenly becoming terrifyingly real. Defeated, Riggs snatched the passport off the table. He turned his back on Elias and Peterson, a petty attempt to maintain some semblance of control, and pulled out his radio. His voice was strained, trying and failing to sound casual. Yeah, dispatch. This is Riggs at Primary Inspection, Secondary Screening Room 3. Got a query for you. He read the passport number out loud, his voice stumbling slightly over the digits. Yeah, that's it. Let me know what you get back. Subject claims diplomatic status. He clicked off the radio. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the incessant hum of the lights. Riggs stood with his back to the room, refusing to look at either man. Peterson fidgeted, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Elias remained perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his breathing even. He was no longer a participant in the drama. He was an observer, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. The wait stretched for what felt like an eternity. Every second was a hammer blow against Riggs's crumbling certainty. The radio on his belt remained silent. Elias knew what was happening on the other end. A simple query in the Pisces and TCS databases would not just confirm his identity, it would likely trigger a cascade of alerts. A diplomat of his rank being flagged at a port of entry was not a routine event. It was a 5-alarm fire. Finally, the radio crackled to life. But it wasn't a voice from dispatch. It was a different voice, sharp and commanding. "Riggs, what the hell is going on down there?" "This is Supervisor Chun." Riggs visibly flinched. He grabbed the radio, turning to face a corner of the room as if to shield the conversation. "Supervisor, I've got a situation here. A possible imposter with a high-quality fraudulent document. A fraudulent document." Chin's voice was incredulous, laced with ice. "Kyle, the man you are holding is Elias Kincaid. He's a special envoy. The system is lighting up like a Christmas tree. I've got alerts from State, Homeland Security, and the Diplomatic Security Service." "What did you do?" The blood drained from Riggs's face. He looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. His eyes, wide with panic, darted around the room, landing on Elias for a brief second before flitting away, unable to meet the calm, knowing gaze that was waiting for him. He stammered into the radio, his voice a pathetic squeak. "Supervisor," he was being uncooperative. The passport looked off. The totality of the circumstances. Chen's voice was dangerously low. "Did you put your hands on him, Kyle?" There was a long, damning silence. "I'm on my way down," Chen said, her tone leaving no doubt as to the gravity of the situation. "Do not say another word to him. Do not touch him. Do not let him leave. Just stand there and wait for me." The radio went silent. Riggs lowered his hand, the radio hanging limply from his fingers. The swagger, the arrogance, the absolute certainty, it had all evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out man drenched in the cold sweat of fear. He turned slowly, his face a mess of confusion and dawning horror. He looked at the blue passport still clutched in his hand, as if it were a venomous snake. He took a hesitant step toward Elias and held it out, a peace offering. "Mr. Kincaid," he began, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. There's been a misunderstanding." Elias looked at the proffered passport, then at the officer's trembling hand, and made no move to take it. He let the man stand there, exposed and humiliated. "There was no misunderstanding, Officer Riggs," Elias said, his voice cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "A misunderstanding is an error in interpretation. What you did was an act of willful prejudice. You saw a black man in casual clothing and decided he could not possibly be a diplomat. You ignored procedure. You ignored evidence. You escalated a routine check into a physical assault and an illegal detention." He paused, letting each word land with devastating accuracy. "You did not make a mistake. You made a choice." Before Riggs could formulate a response, the door flew open and Supervisor Chen entered the room. She was a stern-faced woman in her 50s, her movements sharp and efficient. Her eyes swept the scene, taking in Riggs's terrified expression, Peterson's anxious posture, and Elias's composed but furious stillness. She completely ignored her subordinates. Her focus was entirely on Elias. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, her voice a mixture of professionalism and profound apology. "I am Supervisor Linda Chun. On behalf of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, I want to offer my deepest and most sincere apologies for the abhorrent treatment you have received." She turned her gaze on Riggs, and it was like watching the temperature in the room drop by 20 degrees. The look she gave him was one of pure, undiluted contempt. "Riggs, badge and firearm." On the table. Now Riggs stared at her, dumbfounded. "Supervisor, I was just following procedure." "You have not followed a single correct procedure since you laid eyes on this man," she snapped, her voice cutting through his excuses. "You are a disgrace to this uniform. Your sidearm and your shield." On the table. "You are suspended, pending termination, Riggs's jaw worked silently. His career was dissolving before his very eyes. With fumbling, clumsy movements, he unholstered his weapon and placed it on the metal table. The clatter echoed loudly in the silent room. He then unclipped his badge and placed it beside the gun. He had been stripped of his power, publicly and completely. Peterson, Chun commanded, escort this officer to my office and wait with him. Do not let him speak to anyone. Peterson, looking relieved to be given a clear order, nodded quickly and gestured for Riggs to precede him out the door. Riggs shuffled out like a condemned man, not once looking back. Chun waited until the door closed before turning back to Elias. Sir, I have already been in contact with the State Department liaison. We have a private lounge for you to wait in while we arrange for your immediate and full exoneration from this incident. We will handle your luggage. Is there anyone you need to call? Elias finally took his passport from the table. The cover felt cool and solid in his hand, a small, tangible piece of the authority that had been so viciously challenged. Yes, he said, his voice regaining its usual warmth, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. I need to call my attorney. In the quiet, plush VIP lounge, a world away from the harsh reality of the secondary screening room, Elias made the call. He spoke to the State Department's chief legal counsel, a man he had worked with for over a decade. He recounted the events with dispassionate clarity, but the tremor of fury was evident in his voice. No, Richard, an apology and the officer's suspension are not sufficient, he said, pacing the length of the room. This wasn't about one bad apple. This was systemic. The man felt empowered to act that way. He felt untouchable. On the television mounted on the wall, a news alert flashed across the screen. Developing story. Diplomatic incident at Dulles Airport. A blurry cell phone video was already playing, showing a uniformed officer grabbing the arm of a black man in the customs hall. The court of public opinion was already in session. I want his service record. Elias continued into the phone. I want the complaint history for this port of entry. I want to know how many times Officer Riggs has sent non-white travelers to secondary screening compared to white travelers. This is not about me. This is about every person who doesn't have a diplomatic passport to protect them from this kind of abuse. His colleague on the other end of the line was silent for a moment. Then, Elias, we're with you. 100%. We'll be filing a formal complaint with the Department of Homeland Security's Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And the embassy in the country you just left? They've already issued a démarche. They're protesting the treatment of a U.S. diplomat who was instrumental to their national security. This is going to get very, very big. Elias hung up and sank into an armchair, the exhaustion he had felt earlier returning with a vengeance. But it was no longer just physical. It was a deep, soul-crushing weariness. He had spent his career building bridges, fostering understanding, and upholding the rule of law in the most chaotic corners of the world. He believed in the power of institutions, in the ideals his country was supposed to represent. Yet, in the space of an hour, he had been reminded that for some people, his skin color would always matter more than his credentials, his character, or his commitment to service. The system he served had failed him in the most fundamental way. 6 months later, Elias Kincaid stood at a podium, addressing the newest class of Foreign Service officers. The lawsuit against DHS and CBP was proceeding, with the $9 million figure representing not just personal damages, but a demand for systemic reforms and mandatory, ongoing anti-bias training. Kyle Riggs had been fired and was facing a federal civil rights lawsuit that would likely bankrupt him. The story had become a flashpoint in the ongoing national conversation about race and law enforcement. Elias looked out at the sea of bright, eager faces, young men and women of all races and backgrounds, ready to represent the United States abroad. Your diplomatic passport, he said, holding up the familiar blue booklet, is a powerful tool. It represents the full faith and credit of our nation. It will open doors for you. It will grant you access to the highest levels of power. It will, under international law, make your person inviolable. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. But it will not make you immune to prejudice. It will not change the minds of those who are determined to see you as less than what you are. I learned that lesson not in a war zone or a failed state, but 10 miles from this very building, on American soil. He told them the story. He didn't tell it with bitterness, but with a quiet, solemn gravity. He spoke of the two Americas, the the one of ideals and aspirations, and the one of harsh, lived reality. Your job, he concluded, is not just to represent our country's policies. It is to represent its promise. The promise that a person should be judged by their character, not their color. The promise that authority is a trust, not a weapon. Your greatest challenge will not always be overseas. Sometimes, it will be right here at home, fighting to make that promise a reality for everyone. He placed the passport on the podium, its golden seal glinting under the lights. It was a symbol of his power, his privilege, and his burden, a constant reminder of the work that still needed to be done.